Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction. I'm Alex Howe, and this is episode 18, Movies in the Golden Age. It's been a while since I talked about movies on this podcast, way back in episode 8, in fact. I've spent the past 7 episodes talking about the golden age of science fiction in books and short stories. But the golden age was in the 50s in my estimation, and this was a time when Hollywood was flourishing, and televisions were becoming commonplace, so we can't very well pass those by. And also, there's one movie from a few years later that deserves special attention. If you're a sci-fi movie buff, you probably understand why I chose the music I did for the intro and outro of this podcast. The Blue Danube Waltz was famously used as part of the soundtrack for Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, for the scene where Heywood Floyd flies to the spinning space station on the Pan-American spaceplane. For my younger listeners, Pan Am was an airline that went out of business in 1991. Kinda dropped the ball there. 2001 is actually something of an outlier. Besides its weird and somewhat trippy storytelling, it was made in 1968, well after the golden age of sci-fi in the 40s and 50s. But as we discussed in the last episode, it was produced in concurrence with the book, which was written by Arthur C. Clarke, one of the big 4 authors of the golden age. And the book is considerably less trippy, based more in hard sci-fi, although you can still see the influence of the 60s on it. 2001 is also an outlier because it's not your typical popcorn flick. It was brilliant and groundbreaking in terms of cinematography and special effects. Several of its scenes are iconic in popular culture. And it has a brilliant villain in HAL 9000, not to mention the unforgettable musical score. However, it's also notorious for being slow, confusing, and generally inaccessible to the average viewer. At best, it's one of those movies that doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you've read the book. The original idea for the film was Kubrick's. Again, Clarke's treatment was one that in anyone else's hands would have been called a novelization, even though the novel was intended to come first. Kubrick wanted to make a film about, quote, man's relationship with the universe, unquote. But he also wanted to work with an established sci-fi author to handle the serious writing. A friend from the studio suggested Clarke, and although Kubrick didn't think very highly of him at the time, he agreed to meet with him. Clarke tells the tale in his companion book, The Lost Worlds of 2001. He offered up 6 of his short stories as potential source material for the film, and Kubrick chose The Sentinel, which was the basis for the segment where the monolith is found on the moon. Working together, they also incorporated Clarke's story Encounter in the Dawn as the inspiration for the initial Dawn of Man sequence. Varying accounts exist, but it seems to have been a confluence of creative differences, Kubrick's notorious perfectionism, demands for late changes, and contractual shenanigans that led to the book being released several months after the movie. By then, the stories had diverged quite a bit, but they were always going to have very different storytelling styles. First and foremost, Kubrick wanted the movie to be a quote-unquote non-verbal experience, where the music and the images tell the story. Long stretches of the film are accompanied only by music, while what little dialogue there is almost never heard with music. The sparse dialogue is one of the things that makes it difficult to follow, but the music was what made it so groundbreaking. Kubrick actually did commission an official film score from Alex North, who wrote the music for Spartacus, Cleopatra, Death of a Salesman, and more. But then, he discarded it. It's common in Hollywood to create a temp track to a film for editing purposes. Temporary music before the soundtrack is complete that is used to frame the tempo and mood of the story. It's also common to use classical music for these temp tracks. But when Kubrick heard the temp track for 2001, he liked it so much that he decided to keep it. He thought it framed the story so well that it didn't need anything else. Thus, the title sequence of the sun rising from behind the Earth and the Moon opens on the backdrop of the orchestral fanfare of Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra. The flight of the Pan Am shuttle through space becomes a dance set to the Blue Danube Waltz by Johann Strauss Jr., no relation. And the ghostly operatic wailing that happens whenever the monolith appears on screen comes from a modern classical piece, the Kyrie from the Requiem of Hungarian composer György Ligeti. And those choices are remembered as an indispensable part of the film to this day. So when it came time to set the music for this podcast, I asked myself, what music is out there that is associated with science fiction and isn't copyrighted? Obviously, most movies and TV shows have their own scores, and most songs that are new enough to be sci-fi themed in their own right, like Queen's 39, are also new enough to be copyrighted. So the answer was obvious: the soundtrack to 2001: A Space Odyssey. Of those songs, Also Sprach Zarathustra seemed a little too pretentious, and Ligeti's works are still under copyright, so The Blue Danube was the best choice. My next choice would have been either Holst's Jupiter from the Planets, for obvious reasons, or Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto, which was the lead track on the Voyager Golden Record. But those are both science fact. Neither of them has so clear an association with science fiction as The Blue Danube does. But this episode is about the Golden Age, so let's back up from 2001 and see what Hollywood was contributing to sci-fi in the 50s. The first thing you notice looking at these movies is that they are not like the books of the time. Where authors like Asimov and Heinlein prided themselves on writing hard sci-fi backed up by real science, the movies of that decade were much sillier. B-movies that had more in common with the earlier pulp fiction. The Golden Age didn't look the same in the visual medium, no pun intended. And yet, unlike with novels, the 50s are much less disputed as the Golden Age of sci-fi films. And to some extent they were riding on the author's coattails. At first glance, the lead-up to this time didn't look very similar either. In the 30s and 40s, most quote-unquote sci-fi films were from the Universal Horror series. Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, Jekyll and Hyde, and the like, and their numerous sequels and remakes. That's not just a modern phenomenon. On the other hand, this was also the time when film serials were a thing. What we would call a miniseries or a one-season series on TV today. The first Flash Gordon films premiered back in 1936, not as a 2-hour blockbuster, but 13 20-minute episodes, shown in movie theaters because almost no one had a TV back then. This was the only way to reach a large audience. Unsurprisingly, Buck Rogers got a film serial of his own in 1939. Captain America also got one in 1944. Many of them can be seen on YouTube today, although I don't know much about the sources. As with books, science fiction movies in the modern sense really started to take off after the war. Not coincidentally, this was the same time that superstar sci-fi writers became famous with the wider public. Their famous names lent a lot of credibility to an as-yet untested movie genre. Thus, you have Robert Heinlein co-writing Destination Moon, and Ray Bradbury working on The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. And eventually, Arthur Clarke writing 2001: A Space Odyssey. And much like the Golden Age in books, the big names were creating and getting adaptations of their stories made into the 60s and beyond, but the unique culture that spawned them was very much a 50s phenomenon in Hollywood. Looking at the timeline, 1951 was a banner year for sci-fi movies, although fairly typical of the years following, with The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Thing from Another World, When Worlds Collide, and the first feature-length superhero film, Superman and the Mole Men, which seems like a pretty weird enemy for a debut film, but they did it. And from there, they never looked back, turning out several classic B-movies and even the occasional A-movie every year well into the 60s. There's a lot of material here, and it's hard to know where to start. My original reference was Rotten Tomatoes' list of the top 110 sci-fi films of all time, which had a pretty short list from the 50s. But in the past year since I first compiled my list, they've upgraded it to the top 150 sci-fi films of all time, and it now has a lot more of them. However, looking over the list, I think there are two broad categories that cover most of them: the book adaptations and the monster movies. Actually, many, even most of these movies were adaptations of books or short stories somewhere along the line. But a few notable ones were adaptations of famous books. These include The War of the Worlds, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1984, From Earth to the Moon, Journey to the Center of the Earth, and The Time Machine. Others are adaptations of lesser-known books, like When Worlds Collide, The Thing from Another World, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Notably, The Incredible Shrinking Man was based on a book by Richard Matheson, who was better known for I Am Legend. Conquest of Space was loosely based on a non-fiction book, filled with speculative illustrations of the future exploration of the solar system. It was also consulted by Kubrick for 2001, and was the source for Clark spelling Iapetus with a J, and by Larry Niven for The Soft Weapon. And of course, there's Forbidden Planet, which is a retelling of Shakespeare's The Tempest in space! Adaptations are pretty standard fare, especially of famous books. They're proven stories with an established fan base. The monster movies were different. While earlier ones existed, the ones from the 50s were a reflection of the new fears of the Cold War and nuclear weapons. From the very first one, The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms in 1953, many of the monsters were either created or awakened by nuclear tests. In this case, the giant dinosaur Rhedosaurus, which is linguistically nonsense, is unfrozen from the Arctic ice by one such test, and returns to its former home, rampaging through, where else, New York. The original Godzilla, or Gojira, produced in Japan a year later, had a very similar plot, where nuclear testing awakens the slumbering sea monster Gojira, whose name is based on an early concept for his design, combining the Japanese words for gorilla and whale. In some of the later films, his backstory is changed to that of a mutated lizard. Regardless, Gojira soon rises from the depths and rampages through, where else, Tokyo. The Japanese monster movies had a different flavor, of course, both because of the cultural gap and because they were a reaction to the actual atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki only a few years earlier. Back in America, the same year Gojira came out, Hollywood produced its first giant bug movie, Them! ! This movie starts as a bizarre police procedural, only to eventually discover that the killers are radiation-mutated ants grown large enough to eat people. This one film started its own subgenre, Tarantula, the Black Scorpion, Beginning of the End, featuring giant grasshoppers, The Deadly Mantis, Earth vs. the Spider, Monster from Green Hell, African wasp beetles, and more, a tradition that continues in Sci-Fi Channel B movies to this day. But these movies also spawned a flurry of other monster flicks, Creature from the Black Lagoon, Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, The Blob, The Fly, and even the infamously bad Plan 9 from Outer Space, in which bumbling aliens tried to stop humans from accidentally destroying the universe by bringing horror movie monsters to life. Yeah, it's that bad. Also notable for being Bela Lugosi's last film, as the director edited in unused footage of him from other projects shortly after his death. You see these Cold War political themes throughout the decade and afterwards. The original Planet of the Apes also leans into this, for example. But one especially interesting case is Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which people are kidnapped and replaced by emotionless alien pod people. Many reviewers interpreted this as a criticism of McCarthyism, even though emotionless conformists is usually a stereotype of communism, and indeed the studio meddled with the script to give it a more anti-communist slant. But many people saw Miles being disbelieved and treated as a madman, and interpreted it as symbolic of America's complacency in the face of McCarthyism, and of the bland cultural conformity in Eisenhower's America. However, the truth seems to be that this is a cautionary tale in not overanalyzing works of art. According to production head Walter Mirisch, in his excellently titled autobiography, I Thought We Were Making Movies, Not History, no one involved in the film thought they were making an allegory. Not the producer, not the director, not the screenwriter, and not the author of the book it was based on, Jack Finney. The literary criticism people don't always have it right. Now, after all these shout-outs, I think there's one movie from the 50s that deserves special mention. The highest on Rotten Tomatoes list, and one that is fairly unique for its portrayal of advanced but mostly friendly aliens. The Day the Earth Stood Still from 1951. The Day the Earth Stood Still, based on the short story Farewell to the Master by Harry Bates, begins with a flying saucer landing in Washington, D.C. From the flying saucer emerge Klaatu, an alien who just happens to look like a handsome human male, and Gort, a tall, intimidating robot. Klaatu brings a message for all the leaders of Earth, but in the early days of the Cold War, it is impossible to gather the leaders of the world together, and he is shot and wounded by a nervous soldier and subsequently kept under guard. Eventually, Klaatu gets out and stages a show of power, stopping all electrical devices on Earth except essential services for 1 hour, making the Earth stand still. Even this isn't quite enough, as he is shot again, this time mortally wounded, but he is finally able to give his message. The message is an ultimatum. Now that humans have the capability to leave Earth, we must live peacefully with the rest of the galaxy. For the galaxy is policed by robots like Gort, who possess absolute power to destroy as necessary to maintain that peace. It's a message very clearly meant for the Cold War, and I think much more cleanly told than the environmental message of the 2008 remake. Honestly, I think the messaging in the remake is really problematic. In the original, Klaatu has come to deliver an ultimatum and is careful not to harm anyone. In the remake, he passes judgment himself and leaves millions of people to die even after being convinced to change his mind. It seems like it's missing the point of the original. Even in the original, my thoughts are kind of complicated. I'm not much one for the trope that humans are violent, uncivilized, or destructive compared with aliens. Aliens will be subject to the same biological pressures that we are, and if we ever meet them, I suspect we'll find that we're not dramatically worse, or at least not dramatically slower to grow up, so to speak. However, in this case, I think it's something of an unbuilt trope, meaning the idea as we know it today wasn't established yet, and the original story contains a more nuanced message. To wit, Klaatu warns that humanity's violent tendencies may run afoul of the strict robotic galactic policemen. But if you pay attention, he's actually explaining why those robotic policemen are needed, suggesting that humans aren't that unusual at all, just at a difficult time in our history. It's something that could go a few different ways depending on your point of view. Now, I've talked plenty about movies, but I can't ignore television either. Although that medium was in its infancy, it also contributed to the history of sci-fi. On television, keeping in mind this is rather more provincial to the United States, sci-fi started with children's shows, the first being Captain Video and his Video Rangers, which is way too on the nose. It began airing in 1949 on the Dumont television network, a big name in the early 50s that is largely forgotten today. They went out of business in 1956, and much like the original Doctor Who, most of their archives were recycled or thrown away by the 70s. However, it didn't take long for other networks to cash in on the trend, with half a dozen Space Ranger-type shows running over the next few years, including short-lived adaptations of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, along with the rather more successful Adventures of Superman cartoon show. Contrary to what Toy Story 2 claimed, kids were all over the space stories before the real astronauts went up. I'll also note The Quatermass Experiment, a famous British television serial and later movie from this period. It was a sci-fi horror story about the first human space mission being attacked by aliens. It was an inspiration for many later works, including Doctor Who, 2001, and Ridley Scott's Alien. The other side of the television world was based around the anthology series. Much like the magazines, these told single-episode standalone stories in shows like Tales of Tomorrow and Science Fiction Theater. Though little remembered today, they paved the way for one of the signposts of the genre, the Twilight Zone. But we'll come back to that in the 60s. This has been a reader's history of science fiction. This podcast is available from various hosts around the internet, including YouTube, where you can also see my latest attempt at math-themed animation, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com, where you can see my review of the new sci-fi book, Ready Player 2. My movie recommendation for this episode is The Day the Earth Stood Still. What can I say? It's a classic. And it's a lot easier to understand than 2001. And with this episode, we're done with the golden age of the 50s, but there's lots of good stuff still to come. In the next episode, we introduce the new trend of softer and more socially conscious sci-fi that began in the 50s, but really came into its own in the 60s. This is the new wave. Thanks for listening.